Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 15th University of St. Andrews Carnegie Lecture. This series, as many of you will know, was established to bring to Scotland some of the world's most incisive and imaginative thinkers in the arts, the sciences, education, and international affairs. Those who have shaped international discourse and who continue to reimagine and illuminate the global challenges of our time. Tonight's lecture is exceptional in the truest sense of that word. For the first time, we are joined by not one, but two distinguished speakers, both ambassadors and both exemplars of the kind of principled engagement that the United Nations and indeed the Carnegie tradition invites us to consider anew. It is a great honor to welcome our distinguished alumna, Her Excellency Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward, the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, and His Excellency the Honorable Ambassador Bob Rae, Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations. Now, in a particular coincidence, both of these ambassadors are very shortly concluding their terms as ambassadors, so we are particularly privileged to have them with us on what is a very special occasion at this time. Each of our speakers will offer their own mini lecture this evening. Ambassador Barbara Woodward on the UN at 80, more than an air castle within our grasp, and Ambassador Rae on Where the Light Gets In, the importance of the principled and pragmatic response to the crises of our time. The fact that we have two ambassadors speaking tonight, representing two nations long bound by shared democratic instincts, but speaking also from within the most global of institutions, gives this event a resonance that feels especially timely. The United Nations was founded 80 years ago in the aftermath of catastrophe, an attempt not merely to prevent war, but to rebuild faith in collective purpose. To ask now what remains of that faith and how institutions built from the ashes of one era might adapt to the fractures of another is to engage directly with the challenges that define our moment. Before introducing our speakers more fully, let me reflect briefly on the tradition that brings us together this evening. The Carnegie Lecture Series was launched in 2014 through the generosity of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and I'm always glad to recall that its current president is my predecessor here as principal, Professor Dame Louise Richardson. From its inception, the series has sought to continue the conviction of Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-American industrialist and philanthropist, that knowledge should serve the public good, that the discoveries of intellect and imagination carry their fullest meaning only when shared widely. Carnegie, of course, was a Scot by birth, born in Dunfermline in 1835, but he emigrated to the US with his parents in 1848. Though he became one of the most powerful industrialists of his age, he never ceased to regard education as the truest form of investment. After accumulating vast wealth through his creation of the Carnegie Steel Company in the final quarter of the 19th century, Carnegie devoted himself to philanthropy from his retirement in 1901 until his death in 1919. In his lifetime, he gave away more than 90% of his fortune, the equivalent of tens of billions today, to the advancement of learning, peace, and opportunity. Carnegie maintained close ties to Scotland, and in 1901 he established the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland to realize his belief that the benefits of higher education must be accessible to all. The University of St. Andrews students and researchers have since regularly benefited from the Carnegie Trust, and I speak as a former vice chair of that body. Carnegie also holds a distinctive place in St Andrews history, as he was twice elected rector here by the university's students, serving between 1901 and 1907. I have always been rather fond of his description of St Andrews as the dear old lady university, a phrase that has, alas, not entered the everyday idiom, but which I think captures something of our institution's enduring personality, learned, dignified, occasionally eccentric, and unfailingly independent of mind. Carnegie's life traced a remarkable arc from industrial might to global idealism. He was, in the best sense, a pragmatist who believed in ideals. His two rectorial addresses here reflected that, the first on the economic transformation of his age and the growing dominance of the US industrial base, the second on the moral imperative of arbitration in delivering peace. That combination, the recognition of power with a faith in principle, is not so far from the balance our speakers tonight must also navigate in their work. So let me now turn to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward. Ambassador Woodward is, as I said, the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations, a post she's held since 2020. Before that, she served as British ambassador to the People's Republic of China between 2015 and 2020, the first woman to hold that role, following an already distinguished diplomatic career with postings in Russia, the European Union, and earlier at the UN in both New York and Geneva. An alumna of this university where she studied history, Ambassador Woodward, having earned her degree in 1983, then earned a master's degree in international relations from Yale University in 1990. Her work has been marked by courage and composure in equal measure. She was awarded the OBE in 1999 for her part in securing the release of 2 British hostages from Chechnya, and later appointed a CMG in 2011 and a DCMG in 2016 for her contributions to British foreign policy. Barbara's career has been one of bridging worlds, diplomacy, economics and security, and of representing Britain with intelligence, humanity, and an unfailing sense of proportion. It is a great pleasure to welcome her back to her alma mater this evening. Our second speaker, Ambassador Bob Rae, is Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations. Appointed in 2020, he has since been a leading voice within the UN system and was elected president of the UN's Economic and Social Council for 2024 to 25, only the second Canadian in history to hold that office. Ambassador Rae's public life has been both rich and varied. He served as Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995, and later as interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He was elected to provincial and federal parliaments 11 times between 1978 and 2013, and his career in law, education, and public service has been consistently animated by a concern for justice and social responsibility. Alongside his political achievements, Ambassador Rae has worked as an advocate and mediator in some of Canada's most complex policy and legal fields, from Indigenous rights and constitutional reform to humanitarian diplomacy. He is the author of 6 books, and his written works translate complex global challenges into thoughtful frameworks for principled action. A Privy Councillor, a companion of the Order of Canada, and a member of the Order of Ontario, he is widely regarded as one of his country's most reflective and discerning public figures. So this evening, Ambassador Woodward will speak first, followed directly by Ambassador Rae. There will then be an opportunity for you to ask our speakers questions, which will be moderated by Professor Phillips O'Brien, Professor of Strategic Studies in our School of International Relations. And the evening will then conclude with a vote of thanks from Professor Brad Mackay, Deputy Principal and Vice Principal for International Strategy and External Relations. So for now, please join me in welcoming first Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward and then Ambassador Bob Rae to deliver the 15th University of St Andrews Carnegie Lecture.
Well, good evening, everyone, and Principal Professor Dame Sally Mapstone, thank you very much indeed for those very kind words of introduction. It is a great honour and a great delight to be invited back to St Andrews to deliver half the Carnegie Lecture. It is now over 40 years since I first visited St Andrews, and I still feel the same excitement and joy to be back among the familiar landmarks. It's a special privilege to be here with Ambassador Bob Rae, from whom you will hear shortly. Now, Kofi Annan, who was the UN's 7th Secretary General, was once asked, how many people work at the UN? And with his characteristic laconic humour, he replied, about half of them. But you would be wrong to think that it takes two of us to deliver one lecture. Bob has been an inspiration to me, a mentor, and a huge workhorse during my tenure, which has overlapped entirely with his as ambassador. And we've worked alongside each other on Ukraine, on Afghanistan, on UN relief work in Gaza, on UN reform, on human rights, defending values, and in overlapping and complementary spheres, as the principal said, as I have been permanently in the Security Council and chaired it 4 times in the last 5 years, and Bob has chaired the Economic and Social Council quite brilliantly in this past year, and I'm delighted to be part of this double act. I look forward to his remarks. Now, it is 2 weeks today since we put the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and assorted other members of the UN delegation, all in all 7 ministers and several senior officials, back on their planes to come back to the UK after the UN's 80th high-level week, which, as you all know, attracts the world's leaders to New York. I'm sure you caught excerpts of President Trump's speech, the announcements about the two-state solution for the Middle East, a bit of the debate about Russian drones in Estonia, further aggression against Ukraine, headlines about the UN snapping back sanctions on Iran, or you may have followed the debates around gender equality, the 30th anniversary of the UN conference in Beijing, or the high-level climate meetings in preparation for the 30th anniversary climate conference in November in Brazil, or preparations for the social summit in Qatar, or some of the outputs from the more than 600 other meetings which took place. All of that gives you a flavour of the breadth of the UN's high-level work when leaders come to town. But it gives you a bit less of a sense, I think, of what the UN does day to day for the people it serves around the world. And the UN currently has 140 agencies, you'll know some of them like UNICEF, supporting over 440 million people with 4,000 offices in 110 locations in 193 countries, with a strong focus on delivering 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 targets and 230 indicators. And you can see where this is going. There is a sprawling bureaucracy and a lot of very dedicated people, all trying to work to deliver the UN's core mission, the Charter commitment to advance global peace and security, to advance human rights and development. Which brings me, paradoxically, to Andrew Carnegie, for whom this evening's lecture is named, as Professor Mapstone said. Born here in Fife 110 years before the UN Charter was signed in June in San Francisco, June 1945, in the USA, which, of course, the country that became his adopted homeland. And as I was preparing these remarks, I didn't come across the quotation about St Andrews. I came across his words that air castles are often within our grasp later in life, but then they charm not. Air castles are often within our grasp later in life, but then they charm not. And these words resonated for me in this 80th year of the UN, because we have, I think, predictably and usefully, seen widespread debate about what the UN is 80 years after its founding, and perhaps more importantly, where it is going. Broadly, perceptions of the UN are actually pretty steady. About 60% of people tracked across the world, according to Pew Research, are favourably disposed towards the UN, and about 30% are unfavourably disposed. And I think it's quite possible that this split reflects the air castle that Carnegie spoke about. So among those 60% in favour, I think many people see the UN as a very powerful brand, whether they think of the vision of the UN Charter with its opening words, "We the peoples." And it's hard not to want a world free of fear and want, where might does not equal right. Or people think of UNICEF's work with children. They think of peacekeepers in blue helmets, or the UN's core mission of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, building peace, advancing human rights and development. But conversely, I wonder if among the 30% are many who also have direct knowledge and experience of the UN. Sigrid Kaag, a former Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands who served in several UN roles, including as Special Coordinator for the UN peace process, said recently, "The UN is at a point of irrelevance. That is its predicament. The dream, or what Carnegie might have called the air castle, the dream might live on, but no one looks at the news and says, 'What happened at the UN?' So what I want to explore is this inflection point. Can the UN remain effective and relevant, or is it at risk, in Carnegie's words, of being an air castle which charms not? Now, this debate is particularly acute now, but I want to start back at the beginning. The UN, as Professor Mapstone mentioned, and you all know, was founded out of the ruins, the rubble, and the horror of the Second World War. It was founded, too, on the back of the failure of the League of Nations, which had attempted to bring an end to war after World War I. But even before the United Nations was established, Roosevelt, then President of the United States, was setting out precepts and principles that were essential for a secure, prosperous, and stable society. In his January 1941 speech, he identifies the 4 freedoms: freedom from fear and want, and freedom of expression and worship, which we can trace through to the Charter and present-day human rights thinking. And I think on the back of the Second World War, which added to the horrors of World War I, the Holocaust and the nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it was perhaps no wonder that we had a vision and a need for a vision of something different. So at this point, we have the beginnings of the castle in the air. And in San Francisco in 1945, delegates from 50 nations and every continent representing the cultural diversity of over 80% of the world's population negotiated the UN's founding charter. So we have our castle in the air, metaphorically speaking. But critically, I think, for all of the UN high-mindedness represented in the charter, from the get-go, the UN was something different. With the failure of the League of Nations hanging over them, the drafters of the UN Charter knew they needed to produce something different, more than an air castle. And Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the second and very visionary and charismatic Secretary General of the United Nations, saw this predicament clearly. He said, "Everything will be all right. You know when? When people, just people, stop thinking of the UN as a weird Picasso abstraction and start seeing it as a drawing they made themselves. The UN is about people, it's about we who own and work the UN." How did they do this? I think 3 ways. First, critically, in the early years, and despite the onset of the Cold War, alongside the ideals in the opening chapter of the UN Charter, there are detailed chapters setting out the bodies and the organs of the UN and how it would work. So in the Security Council, which I chaired 4 times in the last 5 years, in the Economic and Social Committee, which Bob chaired last year, the General Assembly, which embraces all of the membership of the UN, the International Court of Justice, as well as arrangements for relations with regional and international organisations. So we've already got infrastructure, first point. Second point, the founders of the Charter and the early leaders of the UN took that momentum and built on it. So we see the multiplication of conventions building on the UN Charter, critically the UN Convention on Human Rights in 1948, leading right up to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1970. Brian Urquhart, who was the founder of UN peacekeeping, reaches his apogee in 1956 when we turn the UN's commitment to making peace into one which has boots on the ground to keep that peace. And we see Security Council reform back in 1965, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in the Q&A. So the second point, they built on the momentum. Third point, I think the early leaders of the UN were not afraid of failure as the League of Nations leaders had been. Dag Hammarskjöld, who I've already mentioned, was a very active SG and of course tragically died in a plane crash in Congo. I think less well known, but also brilliantly highlighted in Thant Mint Oo's excellent recent book, is the role of OOnt, the third Secretary General. He was making direct interventions with Kennedy and with Khrushchev, which underpinned the solving of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in those early years, we have not just a castle in the air, but one which is really delivering with momentum. I think second, we've now moved into a period which brings us up to the present day, where the UN has sort of slowed its momentum. Now, I don't want to deny that the UN has played an important role in shaping global standards and norms that keep us safe and connected. Non-proliferation, human rights, airline standards, telecommunications, all part of the UN's work. The UN has continued to develop standards. Convention on Torture in 1985, Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989, Convention on People with Disabilities in 2006. So there's still an important norm-setting role going on, but it is slowing. The UN still provides life-saving humanitarian support to over 116 million people across 33 countries, and has thus contributed to reductions in poverty, malnutrition, maternal and childcare, and also growth in literacy, and that's a project that continues. And now I'm going to wade into a bit more delicate space. The UN was set up to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I acknowledge there is more conflict now than at any time since its foundation, but the UN is arguably discharging its mission of averting World War III. It has peacekeeping missions in 13 countries, although that number is diminishing. It supports preventive diplomacy and supports countries emerging from civil war like Colombia and Syria. That said, the failures of Srebrenica, the failures of Rwanda in the 1990s, and the current conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan, I think cast a shadow over that record. But we've now got a problem. The UN has been building momentum, building expectations, expanding its mandate, but delivering less and less. So we've got greater expectations and more disappointment. And I think there are three particular challenges the UN faces now. The first is the challenge of impunity. Of course, the Charter has never been fully observed by all member states. Bob and I wouldn't have a job to do if it were. But I think with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we saw a permanent member of the Security Council invade another sovereign state. And Russia has, of course, used its position on the Security Council to block any effective action by the United Nations in Ukraine. Ukraine is not the only case. We've, of course, found ourselves in the Security Council very blocked on taking even humanitarian action in Gaza, let alone something that would help us build towards a ceasefire and the release of the hostages. We found ourselves blocked on Afghanistan. We found ourselves blocked on Myanmar, in Yemen, and the list goes on. And while geopolitics plays out both in the Council and outside it, we have also around that the emergence of countries who expect to be heard. So there's an underlying problem of impunity first. Second, that is coupled with the growing expectations that I mentioned. The UN has definitely shifted from its core mandate of peace and security to much more emphasis on development, I think reflected by the way in which the membership increased in the 1960s, bringing in developing countries for whom development action was important. But the more the UN set norms on children, on torture, on disability, as I said, the higher the expectations rose. And I think now on top of that, the UN faces what are broadly transnational challenges: climate, disease, migration, for which we need collective solutions but are bound by the nation-state framework of the United Nations. So that's the second problem around expectations. Third problem is the UN no longer has an effective bureaucracy or engine to deal with this. Instead, it has what my colleague Guy Ryder, who's the Under-Secretary General for Reform, calls an archipelago of entities. As I said earlier, 140 agencies, 4,000 offices, 110 locations, 193 countries, 4,000 mandates that we know of. They produce 2,500 pages of report every day. Even Bob and I, in our best days, aren't going to read those. They've got duplicative structures. So why do we have a UN AIDS operation separate from the World Health operation? Why do we have a UN Women separate from UN Family Planning? Why do we have a World Food Programme and a Food and Agriculture Organisation? So there's a problem there that the engine is no longer effective for the job that it needs to do. And underlying this, the budget of the UN is over-dependent to the tune of 42% on two countries, the United States and China. The United States is massively in arrears with the UN, and China pays a bit later than would be helpful at the UN. So 42% of the money that the UN needs is not coming into the bank. So this is the point I want to conclude with. There is no doubt from my experience over my last 5 years that we need the UN to succeed. We think back on what it was founded for and what it can achieve and the problems that we address now. So it cannot become an irrelevant castle in the air. And I think, to return to Carnegie, this castle is truly within our grasp. And we need to do three things. The first is we have to tackle this archipelago, this massive complex bureaucracy, and make the engine effective. And that is what the UN80 reform programme is doing. And Bob and I are part of a group in New York which has been pushing this programme hard. It'll be difficult because member states, of course, can dig their heels in and oppose it. But we need to persevere with UN reform first. Second, I think to tackle the challenge of impunity, we need to improve accountability. It's core that we hold countries and leaders and individuals accountable for what they do. We've seen sanctions put on individuals and countries by the UN. We've just snapped them back on Iran. But more recently, we've seen the International Court of Justice come through with opinions. We've also been working in, for example, Ukraine and in Sudan to help collect evidence that could be used in future trials, particularly for violence against women. My work in the Security Council, when we've discussed Ukraine, has been about calling Russia out to counter their disinformation and lies and try to avoid this might is right world, to force debates, to force a spotlight on what Russia is really doing in Ukraine. And then thirdly, I think we need to do more to meet these new expectations. The UN needs to become perhaps a bit less risk-averse. Now, to be fair, we have in the last couple of years signed two very important treaties. In the wake of COVID, we agreed internationally a pandemic treaty last year, which would ideally, in the face of a new pandemic, put us in a stronger position to coordinate. And the year before that, we signed a treaty on, BBNJ is beyond borders national jurisdiction. So the sea and the ocean life that is not protected by the international law of the sea, which is out in the ocean, to collaborate to try and make sure that that doesn't become polluted, so a contribution to climate change. So, and during my term as PR, we also introduced new topics to the Security Council to try and make it more relevant. So we have had debates on the security implications of COVID, security implications of climate, and AI. We haven't gone all the way, but this is part of moving the UN into being relevant in the 21st century. So in conclusion then, let me come back to Andrew Carnegie. As I said, he said, air castles are often within our grasp late in life, but then they charm not. And after 5 years as the UK's permanent representative to the UN, through over 1,200 Security Council meetings, I reflect that, yes, the UN is the best kind of air castle. Its values, its principles, its global reach is unmatched. It is much imitated, and it is still very relevant. Second, the air castle that is the UN has been and remains so much more than just a castle in the air. It has done a lot of good for norm setting and for ordinary people around the world, from which we all benefit today. Thirdly, we are at an inflection point. At 80, this air castle that is the UN does remain within our grasp. It's charming a lot less than it could be, but with the sort of reforms that I have outlined, I think we could put it within our grasp. That's why we're working so hard for UN reform. And so that way, even if, as the Second Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld said, even if the UN cannot lead men to heaven, it can at least save them from hell.
Now you're going to hear from hell. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you so much, Principal Mapstone and everyone for coming tonight. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be back with Barbara. And this is her, I think she told me this was her final official act. Mine will have to wait for about another 3 weeks. But it is, I think, we find ourselves in much the same mood. We have not exchanged notes, and we have not seen each other's texts. But you will find no dramatic disagreement between what Dame Barbara has said and what I am saying, although I phrase it a little differently and bring a little bit more, if you like, sort of my own sense of things that is always slightly idiosyncratic. So that's defined my style. So, writing more than 75 years ago on the island of Jura, just 200 kilometers to our collective west, George Orwell famously described in his last great novel, 1984, a dystopian, totalitarian world where Big Brother knew our every word and even our thoughts, where large power blocks suddenly switched alliances. Who would have thought such a thing? And the world was in an endless perpetual war where the proles, as he called them, lived in dreary poverty, and even the quest for a private love affair led to betrayal and doom. At the time it was published, Orwell's book was seen as a brilliant attack on communism and was adopted by conservative commentators as an attack on the excessive state power that was a constant risk even societies that saw themselves as free. But we now live in an age where some people seem to think that Orwell was actually writing a guidebook on how politics should happen, where propaganda, surveillance, and political lying are actually fully justified in this view if we do it ourselves, and where the clear objective of social media outlets and the people who own them is to create so much disinformation that we shall become passive idiots like the proles, where disinterest and even hatred of politics or the search for truth become the order of the day, and where we have become so determined to find the luxury of conformity that we are afraid of freedom itself. At the time that Orwell was writing his book, which he made clear was written as a warning, and not, in fact, as a how-to, the world came together at the end of World War II, as Barbara has so brilliantly described, to try to build a stronger system of laws, of rules, and norms that would protect us from the same fate as has enveloped the world since 1914, a world of conflict, aggression, economic crashes and depressions, high tariffs, colonialism and empire, and deep poverty for the vast majority of the world's peoples. Dame Barbara and I have been working together at the UN since the summer of 2020, and we are concluding our terms at roughly the same time. It's a great privilege working has been a great privilege working with her these past 5 years. Unlike Dame Barbara, I did not have an illustrious diplomatic career, and reading Sally Mapstone's description of my life, I sort of wondered, who is that person that she is describing? And after university, I found myself immersed in the world of law and politics. So what I have to say to you in these few short minutes is that politics, law, and diplomacy share this in common. They are all and both about power and values. The French philosopher Blaise Pascal put it this way in his famous paradox. Justice, as he said, without the power of enforcement is impotent, but power without justice is better called tyranny. And this is the dilemma in which we currently find ourselves. This is the inflection point which Barbara has been describing. The values and aspirations of the UN and of the web of international laws and conventions, the archipelago that Barbara was describing, this is something we have been building for generations. And if they are not sufficiently strong, and if there is a gap between enforcement and aspiration, it is because they do not have enough power behind them. We sometimes think that power is evil, but it isn't. It's a necessary component of any effective institution. It has to have the power to be able to carry out the responsibilities and the duties it has been given. And yet, at the same time, we have to say, and no one has pointed out this better and more eloquently than the quiet person on the panel at the moment, Phillips O'Brien, and the power that many world leaders, states, and corporations are today taking for themselves are more like tyranny than democracy, because they do not accept the higher power of the law and justice. I often use this American example to describe the problem. It comes from the 1830s when President Andrew Jackson was in power, and when the indigenous people living in the state of Georgia took their case to the Supreme Court of the United States because they had what they thought was a valid treaty with the federal government of the United States. The state legislature of Georgia was determined to seize their land. Andrew Jackson agreed with them. Chief Justice John Marshall sided with the Cherokee Nation. Jackson was furious, and he famously said, "The Chief Justice has made his decision. Let him enforce it." What followed was a grotesque and tragic injustice, the famous Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee people were dispossessed and expelled from their historic lands and forcibly displaced to Oklahoma, with many dying on the way. As we speak today, and Dame Barbara again has referred to this, there are today more than 140 million people that are displaced and dispossessed in the world, the highest number that we've seen since the end of World War II, caused both by an unprecedented number of conflicts and a rapidly changing climate, which is forcing people off the land, which is no longer arable. In three other key areas of public policy, there are just a few of them, the shared challenge is that attempts to rein in the exercise of raw power, to put the law and justice above all of us and effectively enforced, these efforts are not, in fact, succeeding. In the realm of trade regulation, where one country is now breaking every international rule and imposing tariffs unilaterally, forcing countries to make bilateral deals that will be less favorable than previously accepted international agreements. That's one. Two, on climate change, where we're already seeing a steady retreat from key agreements. First, to agree to measure carbon emissions, which is the first thing we have to all agree that we will do, and second, to agree to a timetable to reduce carbon emissions. It's called the treaty. It's called the Paris Treaty. Treaty was signed. It has no effective enforcement mechanism. If you don't do it, nothing happens. There is no way of holding people accountable. Third, we're behind in the international regulation of AI and what that means for a safer digital universe. The social media cesspool is getting more polluted, and the fight for truth is more challenging than ever. George Orwell's world of systematic lying and spying actually is a lot like our world today. But Orwell didn't give up, and he spent his life warning people what would happen, in describing it, and insisting on the importance of simply telling the truth. In the face of all this, as well as the collapse of the necessary global consensus on the financial and economic steps that will be necessary to ensure more and better funding for a world that is less poor and less unequal, as well as the painfully slow progress on UN reform itself, it would be easy to simply throw up our hands and say, stop the world, we want to get off. In fact, I've heard one particular political leader say words very much to that effect. We all know that that actually can't be done. So engagement, really serious, steady, thoughtful, persistent engagement is the only answer. Now, this is where the title of my lecture comes in. I knew you were all waiting for this, so I give it to you. In his famous song, Anthem, I'm not going to sing it, Leonard Cohen reminds us, you can add up the parts, but you won't have the sum. You can strike up the march, there is no drum. Every heart to love will come, but like a refugee. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offerings. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The great Russian writer Boris Pasternak put it this way when he said, life is never an easy walk across an open field. Our fate, the fate of our generation, and the fate of our times is to struggle through our own imperfections to make something better, not perfect, but better. How we keep our principles will depend on the ingenuity of our pragmatism. The weakness and failure of the UN is not actually an accident. It stems directly from the decisions that countries made in 1945 to protect their sovereignty and to make collective security largely voluntary. To the vetoes of the 5 permanent members, and you'll understand as a Canadian, I'm less keen on these vetoes than the representative of the United Kingdom. I know you haven't used yours, but still you've got it in your pocket. Must be added 2 other vetoes, which people don't often talk about. The first and foremost is the ability of countries to determine their own level of commitment. So in a sense, every country has a veto because they can just say, I won't play, or I won't pay. You know, we're surrounded by a bunch of deadbeat dads who are supposed to be paying for 42% of the budget of the United Nations. They're not doing it. And second, the veto that is the level of deterrence. Nuclear, yes, of course, but also the balance of terror, the unpredictability of what anyone can do in the face of activity. Each global actor can exercise, and not only nation states, as we have learned. These vetoes are not to be found in the UN Charter, but they exist, and they have created a dynamic where the UN and other multilateral institutions designed to create peace and security are only as strong or as weak as we choose to make them. So what are the bells that still can ring? Well, here's one. Our own individual capacity, each and every citizen in the world, each and every member of the world community has the capacity to think, to feel, and to learn. The second is our ability to work with others. So while we can't do anything alone, we can actually do a lot in partnership. We can do a lot by working with each other to defining our goals, as we're trying to do with this informal group that Barbara and I are part of, and our successors will be part of, where we're actually trying to say, okay, what are the things we can change? Let's form some kind of alliances that crosses over geography, isn't limited by whether you're a NATO member or a European or a Latin American, but we are talking to everybody to try and see how can we build this alliance more effectively. The third is our ability to listen. Here I am in a lecture theater, I'm talking, hopefully some of you are listening. We give courses in public speaking. We give almost no courses in public listening. And it's a serious challenge. We are not listening to each other. We're not hearing what other people are saying. And we have to be able to engage in the process of listening and of acting that is at the heart of every successful collective effort to achieve anything. And in these efforts, our enemies are within us and they're also outside us. Bullies and tyrants will hold sway if we fail to describe them for what they are, if we fail to call it as it is and tell it like it is, and if we fail to respond. Equally important as negative forces are the little voices inside our heads that are telling us to find ways to just get along and don't make waves. Peace is not just the absence of conflict. It is also the presence of something called security, the active sense that justice is with us and that the bullies will be dealt with. That's how we operate in our own states. We expect bullies to be dealt with. We expect the traffic laws to be enforced. We expect laws against thievery and against acts of violence. We expect them to be enforced. And if we find a gap of enforcement, we no longer feel secure. We no longer feel that we have peace. Peace requires architecture. It requires institutions. It requires sources of protection, just as surely as war requires planning, logistics, strategy, and armaments in order to have a chance of success. But we've also had to learn the difficult lesson that giving in to aggression and seeking to accommodate dictators is actually no guarantee of peace. Submission only buys time. Submission never buys peace. I'm going to tell you a brief story before I close. Story of two young men, James McAllister and Frank Pickersgill, who flew in behind enemy lines. They knew that there was only a 50% chance that they would survive. They were a member of an organization called SOE. They didn't make it. They were brutally killed in Buchenwald. A colleague of theirs wrote a wonderful poem about their lives. And he said, a little bit of a dialogue, one of them trying to make up his mind. Am I going to do this? Am I going to sign up? Am I going to go? He says, he was too brave. He never truly knew himself. He should have waited. He was too highly strung, but he had so much courage. And without a core of courage, how can anything be achieved? How can anything be built? And courage shadowed by weakness may be the most precious of all, since it carries sweetness into the heart of the building. It carries it like honey into the hollows of the honeycomb. Andrew Carnegie's vision for a League of Peace that he described in his rectorial address here at this university went way beyond either the League of Nations or the United Nations. He wanted to have a world government that would have the capacity to enforce peace. What Churchill in his Fulton address in 1946 would describe as a real constabulary. But neither the First War nor the Second have proved hellish enough to get countries to agree to the creation of a global agency with as much capacity to enforce peace as we need. We owe it to ourselves to show an even deeper determination to make peace happen, as we are perhaps seeing today, this very day, and understand that it is by strengthening global institutions and not by weakening them or pulling away from them that we make the progress that must be made to, in Carnegie's famous words, to try to make the world a better place than you found it, which means you will have a noble motive in your life. And he also went on to say, whoso wants to share the heroism of battle, let him join the fight against ignorance and disease and the fight against the mad idea that war is necessary. What we still must see as the world's work is keep finding the cracks where the light gets in, the courage, if you will, to bring the honey deep into the hollows of the honeycomb. It is often challenging, it is daunting, and yes, it can be discouraging. Like the work of the medieval cathedral builders, we shall not see it completed in our lifetimes. But it is worth the effort, and on our journey, we cannot let the naysayers, let alone the purveyors of no hope, carry the day. Peace and prosperity, like all projects, are built a step at a time. But these are the human footsteps we must take, and when we look up, let us be guided by the search for the light. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege on behalf of the university to offer a vote of thanks to our distinguished speakers, Ambassador Dame Barbara Woodward and Ambassador Bob Rae, for their thoughtful, deeply informed, and profoundly important reflections this evening. Dame Barbara, as an alumna of the university, we take great pride in all of your achievements and in the clarity and conviction for which you have represented the United Kingdom at the United Nations, as well as your posts in China and beyond, and of course, as your last public engagement as the UK's ambassador to the UN. What an honor it is that you're spending it with us. And Ambassador Rae, your leadership as Canada's permanent representative and your eloquent moral and intellectual advocacy on the global stage are really an inspiration to us all. And I have to say, on a personal note, Ambassador Rae's ideas and writings have been influencing me since I was a student, which, not to worry, Ambassador, was very recently indeed. Tonight's lectures, the UN at 80, more than an air castle within our grasp, and where the light gets in, the importance of a principled and pragmatic response to the crisis of our time, have reminded us of something fundamental, that the rules-based international order and the institutions that sustain it are not just abstract constructs, they are the architecture of peace, progress, and our shared humanity. For nearly 80 years, institutions like the United Nations have provided the scaffolding for dialogue instead of conflict, for cooperation instead of isolation. They have helped lift millions, if not billions, out of poverty. They've fostered human development, sustainable development goals, advanced education, and enshrined principles of human rights and dignity. And even in moments of crisis, perhaps especially in those moments, they have stood as imperfect but indispensable mechanisms for collective action. Yes, as both of our speakers tonight have acknowledged, these institutions are under strain. The consensus that built them is fraying. The ideals that animate them are contested. But tonight's discussion has also reminded us that the answer cannot be to abandon or to diminish them. It must be to renew and strengthen them. The challenge of our century, whether it's from climate change to migration or from conflict to inequality, are inherently global. Whilst they must be solved, this cannot happen by nations acting alone. As St. Andrews scholars, students, and citizens of the world, we are called on to engage critically but constructively with these institutions to bring both principle and pragmatism to the work of rebuilding trust, of defending truth, and reimagining cooperation for a new era. Ambassadors Woodward and Rae, thank you for reminding us that the light still gets in, and that even amid division, hope and progress, perhaps those air castles within our grasp, hope and progress have to remain possible through shared endeavor and, of course, moral courage. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in expressing our very deep gratitude for their insight, for their service, and for their example. Thank you very much.